One of my favourite topics that I've researched over the years, and that I've not really touched on for a good long while now, is biotechnology and genetics and immunology. The reason why is because I had to get a deeper understanding of this kind of subject. I had to literally teach myself genetics. And according to quite a lot of academics that I've spoken to on this subject, my knowledge is quite good, better than most. I've done quite a good job, apparently. I have a good understanding of it. See, obviously, what got me interested in this topic was the COVID pandemic. All the stuff that went on. But critically, most of it was down to the mRNA vaccine technology that I'd been immediately suspicious of. And the reason why is because this was down to a lecture that I'd watched by on psychoneurobiology and warfare. A lecture done by a guy called Dr. Charles Morgan. Now, this was at West Point, which is the military academy in the US, quite a prestigious military academy in the US. Charles Morgan was an interesting guy, or is an interesting guy, should I say. He was head of DARPA's science division, and was also the lead science director for their DREADS program. Now, DREADS are an interesting sort of beast in and of themselves. They're essentially an enzyme that is manipulated to react to certain stimuli. They're actually glycoproteins, that's what they're called. They're essentially sugars. And these proteins, these manipulated proteins, are stimulated by the initially used designer drugs to stimulate these proteins, and they were initially intended to alter the chemical makeup of the brain in soldiers with severe PTSD. It actually had quite a benign and altruistic sort of purpose initially, even though it came out of DARPA. But it was quickly discovered that these proteins could be inserted into gene editors, and the same stimuli could be used to alter the makeup of the gene editors remotely. And they did this using either sound or light. The process is called optogenetics or sonogenetics. That's another term for it, and it's quite a rapidly growing industry at the moment. The reason being is, like I said, they can use these proteins to essentially trigger the CRISPR genes to manipulate and alter themselves on the fly. Essentially do it from outside the body and remotely. Meaning that a genetic condition, if it's discovered that what they've done doesn't entirely work, this is the thinking behind it, what they've done doesn't entirely work, rather than just inject you with another dosage of CRISPR gene editors to combat what they've done, they just manipulate the gene editors inside your body remotely, and that will alter what they do. Now this is marvellous, so it's a marvellous sort of discovery. But that's not all they can do. You see, essentially what a CRISPR gene editor is again another enzyme that is attached to mRNA. And it's called, well, there's two. There's Cas9 and there's Cas5. And what they essentially are is reverse transcriptase. Whenever you inject mRNA into the body, or whenever your body naturally produces mRNA anyway, right? In certain areas of your body, like your liver, your kidneys, all the soft tissue, where cell regeneration is quite prominent. And what mRNA is essentially a block of proteins that your body will naturally use to edit your genes if there's any sort of mistakes that are made. It does happen, yeah, over time, occasionally. Now what will happen is this mRNA will get taken to wherever your DNA is being replicated inside your body, like I said, like places like the liver, and it will be pasted over the top of, say, of a certain genetic sequence, one that is wrong, and the enzymes, the reverse transcriptase enzymes, will then latch on to the DNA strand and will either cut it, or it will nullify it, so it'll dull it, so the body ignores it, and then it will change it, and it will use that strand of mRNA to make the alteration, and then that mRNA will go and it'll be part of your DNA. And this is natural, it's perfectly natural, Your body does it all the time. These mRNA injections, however, hijack that process and put a synthetic strand into the body. But they took away, they said that they took away the reverse transcriptase gene that made it so it wouldn't get transcribed into the body. Now, what they didn't tell you was that your body, as soon as it detects it, will naturally produce that anyway. What they also didn't tell you was they also added the dread glycoprotein into that mRNA sequence. We know this because someone actually looked at the ingredients of the mRNA vaccines and found all sorts of little bits and bobs that shouldn't be there, and one of them was this glycoprotein, this dread glycoprotein. It's S2, it's called. This effectively turned those mRNA vaccines into a remotely editable gene editor. that they injected you with, that your body would naturally produce. And would continue to produce until it was triggered by either, in this case it would be sound, but they could have used light, and these sound frequencies would essentially would get your body to mimic the chemical process that you would produce if you were on certain drugs. Something else that we don't tell you about. The reason why I'm sort of going through all this is I was watching a video that Dino Bain released, and it was featuring a guy called Dr. Mike Yeadon. Now, Dino Bain mistakenly stated that Mike Yeadon was a former vice president of Pfizer. It wasn't quite the vice president of the whole of Pfizer. It was more the vice president of the respiratory and allergy research department for Pfizer. So to say he was more than qualified to talk on these matters during the COVID pandemic is an understatement. If anyone would know exactly what was going on during that time, it would be this guy. And he did quite a lot. Ended up being smeared relentlessly by the system. Ruined his reputation. During that time, he was also struggling with the realization that respiratory viruses don't actually exist. There's no real evidence for respiratory viruses. Now, as for viruses in general, that's a different argument. But respiratory ones are definitely one. There are other underlying causes for the symptoms that are experienced during respiratory illnesses. But as for viruses themselves, there's no real sort of actual evidence for them. Now, Dr. Yeadon was essentially explaining all this in this video that Dino Bain put, and going over the use of vaccines and how they were essentially being used to cool the population of the planet. It's true. And you would be forced to take it because of your digital ID and digital currency and everything else. Again, also true. But what he didn't mention was how they would create these scenarios where they would force you into taking these shots. And this is something else that you're able to do using this combination of DREADS and CRISPR. Now, the DREADS program of DARPA and the CRISPR technology have been used hand in hand since before 2017 when Dr. Charles Morgan was doing that lecture. But they actually began working with, like I said, they began working with CRISPR then, and in 2017 they pretty much got it so it's commercially viable. And it was being implemented within CRISPR pretty much from that date. The reason why he was doing that lecture, essentially was telling us that this is already done, it's already been done. Anyway, what they're able to do using these gene editors is essentially they can cause your own body to generate a pathogen within your body, okay? Remotely. Remember, remotely. I mean, you can do all sorts of these things. They can effectively play God, because you can get your own DNA to attack your own cells, to cause damage to cells. Like I said, they can create pathogens on the fly, particularly what could be considered as a virus, and essentially through the use of very low sound frequency technology, effectively target an area and have everyone in that area suddenly come down with a strange sort of contagion, and everyone would believe it's perfectly natural. In actual fact, it isn't anything but. The other thing you can do with these as well is you can extend the telomeres of your DNA, which is essentially what dictates the amount of time that your DNA will be replicated for before it starts to degrade, which is basically age, the aging process. They can actually top up the telomeres, can actually extend those telomeres, even stop those telomeres from degrading. Which I know sounds very sci-fi, that they can possibly make themselves immortal, but this is something that several academics have been saying is coming within the next 20-30 years, and they said this like 20 years ago. There's quite a few that turned around and said this would be the last generation that would see death being a natural course of life. Obviously just for the rich, not for the... Well, this was something that Dr. Yeadon didn't mention, and I don't know if it's because he didn't know about it or it just didn't cross his mind at the time to go over that, but this is essentially what we've been doing with these mRNA vaccines, injecting people to get this editing technology inside people. Now, if you're unlucky enough to have either the AstraZeneca or the J&J ones, then you've got an even worse deal, because those vaccines didn't carry an mRNA, any mRNA inside them. They were the very first sort of forays into the realms of DNA vaccine. DNA being inserted within what they called a viral outer shell. Now, if you know anything about viruses, you know that the outer shell of a virus is mRNA. It's made of RNA and mRNA. So putting mRNA within mRNA is a stupid idea. So that outer shell was used to house something, and that something was a DNA strand, a strand of DNA. All of this all of this has been pretty much made public now. The leading CRISPR scientific research centre in the world a couple of years ago now essentially came out and said that they can now manipulate CRISPR gene editors remotely from outside the body, and have done successfully a few times. Yeah, true. However, what they didn't tell you was how that testing was done, where that testing was done. How long you've been testing it for. The fact is that testing had been done quite extensively and covertly, primarily at one location, and that was the Astro World Festival. That rapper whose name Travis Scott ended up doing, and had all those people dying very strangely, collapsing. Everyone that went there could only go there if they were vaccinated. That was one of the stipulations, which during the time of the pandemic no one really questioned. But then there were reports throughout the day of people essentially hearing the same sort of low frequency hum that was coming out of the speakers all day before the concert even started. Like Travis Scott's concert. This hum, this very low frequency hum, was ever present throughout around. One of the way that they get this to work, to manipulate the actual threads that are inside your body, yeah, is they need first of all a carrier wave, a carrier signal. Yeah, you need dual frequencies, one an octave above the other. You have a carrier wave which when it penetrates the body, those threads will identify that as a sort of an instruction coming through, yeah, coming through to them. Then you have another wave over the top of that is the instruction wave, yeah, and that carries the instructions for the threads to manipulate the CRISPR editor in a particular way. And it will react pretty much immediately. This does have downsides, or even though it can be quite specific to a single person, which you can do, it can also be triggered accidentally, which has happened countless times. And it's usually in a way that affects the heart, yeah. When all these footballers were dropping dead on the field, you would have noticed, and I've actually put footage up of the sound in the actual stadiums where these people were collapsing and dying, and you can hear a very sort of low rumble from the supporters, from the crowd. They're all stamping their feet, cheering or booing, etc., etc., etc. And this actually accidentally triggers that a sort of a response within that individual that's on the pitch. And it's like the dreads identify that as a kill switch for that person. You get what I mean? And then when the actual person dies and they have an autopsy done, it's found that they've got scarring around the heart, or bruising around the heart muscle, which indicates basically just a heart attack. And any pathologist worth his salt will just assume that it's natural, that it's a natural occurrence. When in actual fact, it's actually the body being instructed to attack itself. I'll leave a link in the description to my series on called Resonance, Crispr and Dreads, that goes into this in great detail, just using their own documents, showing you their own documents, showing you their own video lectures, just telling you outright that we're doing this and this is what it does and how it works and blah blah blah. Essentially, none of it's very complicated. It's all very sort of. It is one of the most surprising things that I discovered when I was trying to teach myself genetics. Basically, was that a lot of it was common sense. It's just hidden behind Latin phrases and jargon more than anything else. Acronyms, lots of acronyms. But essentially, you can turn around and say that wibbly bit connects to that other wibbly bit there and creates another non-wibbly bit. Yeah, and you get the same sort of general idea. So yeah, that was something that Mike Yeadon missed. There was also something else as well that I've mentioned before, and he didn't mention this, but I've covered countless times before, and people kind of mistake what I meant. And essentially, there was a guy called Brian Ardis, and his idea is that what people were saying is COVID was actually people being poisoned by snake venom. Now, the way he's come out with that idea, or the way it's delivered, or the way he believes it's being delivered through the water supply, is kind of wrong, but also kind of right at the same time. See, he is right, that venom is a big factor of it. And yes, it is being given to us through the water supply. But the source of the venom and the way it's being filtered through the water, like given to us through the water supply, is not how he thinks. For the past, I'd say, 50 years since we began to treat heart disease and heart attacks and circulatory problems and neurological problems with medication, we've done that through the use of certain snake venoms and certain other venomous organisms. And the reason why they do this is because there's particular enzymes within particular venoms that do certain things to the body that are useful in treating particular conditions. So say for instance your blood is too thick and you need it to be thinned out, then there's a certain enzyme within particular venomous organisms that will actually thin your blood, and if you can isolate that enzyme and inject it basically administer it to somebody in small enough doses, it will effectively thin that person's blood quite naturally without killing them. Same with blood thickness, same with certain enzymes that will attack the muscles of the heart, either by paralysing them briefly to realign the regulation in your heart, basically, in your heartbeat, or with certain neurological conditions, epilepsy, such like strokes. There is certain enzymes in particular venoms that will attack those specific areas of the brain that need to be attacked in a way. Yeah, altered, or again paralysed briefly to prevent certain conditions from getting worse. And these the amounts of different sort of venomous organisms that have been used to create these drugs over time has grown exponentially over the past 50 or so years. Now, at the same time, these drugs have been getting more and more into the drinking water supply of particularly major cities of the Western world, particularly because of the way that we derive our drinking water. Yeah? As populations get bigger, or have gotten bigger, they've needed other ways to get drinking water and clean drinking water to these populations, and over time they've had to eventually begin to treat sewage water and pump that into reservoirs to store it. So they've been using certain chemical agents to clean that water, to purify it, or they've used filters. These filters, however, aren't designed to, or fine enough to filter out certain chemicals. Essentially, the quantities of chemicals needed to clean these chemicals out, to clean these drugs out of the water supply, would essentially kill everyone. So obviously that's not not an option that they wanted to use. As more and more people move to these larger cities, more and more of these drugs got into the water supply, and the more dangerous the levels of these drugs became. Governments around the world have been waiting for a tipping point to come about with the levels of these drugs where they get too dangerous and people would start literally dying. especially those already on these drugs, because the dosages of these drugs that you have to have when you have to take them have to be extremely exact and taken at the exact same time every time to keep these levels at a safe, not only a safe level, but one that's going to be beneficial to you. And it got to the stage where they knew these people that were already taking these drugs and were drinking water, obviously, would then start to accidentally OD through no fault of their own. Worse still is that because they didn't know what was happening, and the doctors weren't made aware of this either, the physicians, when they would arrive at a hospital presenting with the symptoms they would describe would sound like a very severe flu. In the vast majority of cases. And they would remain flu-like for a particular period of time, depending on the fitness, age and body mass of the person, until they catastrophically arrest, basically, and then they die. But to any physician that was watching this, they would just see this as a very severe flu that this person's come in with and then suddenly died unexpectedly from the same flu. And this began happening a lot in China initially, another place where a lot of these drugs are widely available and widely used. And then the same thing began to happen in America and the UK and everything else. For a long while before, during and after, many other governments, and they've been witnessed doing this a lot, were testing the water supplies of every major city regularly. And they were doing this mostly, in my view, although we can't say for sure, but mostly to figure out which area was going to be next to have a mass casualty event, essentially, brought about from the water supply. Now, like I said, it was mostly people that were already had several comorbidities, if you remember, that were dying, not of COVID, but with COVID. Mostly cardiac patients, but also neurological patients, those that were overweight, diabetic, yada yada yada. There was also fit people that were dying, or seemingly fit, but they just had a susceptibility to these drugs, a high susceptibility to these drugs, and will find themselves affected by them in a more significant way than normal people would, which is why we saw effectively so little death, and only certain demographics and certain people that were dying from, well, with COVID. But then you also had the views from the Dazalam that was in British care homes, which is another factor. It was basically everything to psychologically break the population and make them think that a real pandemic was happening when it wasn't. All of these factors contributed to that sort of psychological programming. which is what convinced many that this was actually really going on. And in actual fact, it wasn't. So although Brian Ardis was wrong, like I said, he was also right as well. Because this is something else that, again, they didn't tell you about, but they were holding conferences about since 2011, where the main subject, the main focus of these toxicology conferences was the prescription medication contamination of the water supply around the world and how they were going to prevent it, or at least tackle it, and they were effectively stopped at every corner. Every avenue they went down, because all of the solutions were extremely expensive. And governments simply didn't want to pay. So yeah, that was something else that Mike Yeadon kind of didn't talk about. I'm not saying it's because he did that maliciously or omitted it on purpose. Very likely just because he simply didn't know. I mean, even there's a great many people that sort of distance themselves from Brian Ardis. Right, so the guy's a kook in a lot of ways, but in this regard he was pretty right. He almost nailed it. I did actually try and contact the guy quite a few times, and never received a response. Really, kind of disappointing, because I wasn't pulling his theory apart. I was basically telling him where he'd gone wrong. But I don't think he was interested in knowing, which opens up lots of questions about him then. But that's a story for another time. Anyway, I think I've waffled enough. I just thought that seeing that video from Dr. Yeadon was very sort of interesting. But I felt there was some more context that needed to be gone over, really. Which is why in this video. Anyway, thanks for watching. See you later.